Dusty Creek, Wyoming Territory, summer 1872. The sun beat down like a curse, baking the wooden planks of the town square until they steamed with dust. Men leaned in the shadows of storefronts, sweat darkening their collars. Women averted their eyes. The center of attention stood on a raised platform, her wrists bound in front of her, head high despite the fear in her eyes. "Last one," the auctioneer barked, wiping sweat from his brow with a filthy cloth. "Who'll take her? Young, quiet, strong enough for light work." Someone in the crowd spat. "Nobody wants a China girl who can't even speak English." Laughter, thin and cruel, crackled like kindling. The girl on the platform didn't flinch. Her name was Li Hua. She was 18. Her dress, once red, had faded to a dusty brown, and her black hair was braided tightly down her back. She hadn't spoken since the journey began. She didn't cry, but her hands trembled slightly, a betrayal of the fear she held behind her stillness. "She ain't worth $1, someone muttered. "She'll be dead by winter," another added. The auctioneer's voice rose again, sharp with impatience. "Come on now, she's the last, don't leave me with dead weight." A hush fell. Bootsteps approached, slow, heavy, sure. James Morgan stepped out from beneath the shade of the saloon's awning. 32, tall, lean, worn black coat, dust-streaked boots. He walked like a man who had lost more than he said and carried it in his silence. A widower 5 years, no children, and a ranch 3 miles east of town, with only horses and wind for company. He stopped at the foot of the platform, squinting up at the girl. "I'll give $50. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer blinked. "50? For this one?" "She's not for sale anymore," Morgan said calmly, reaching into his coat. "I'm not buying her to work. I'm giving her a name. Mine. I want her as my wife." The crowd went silent. The wind paused like it was listening. "She don't speak a word of English," someone said under their breath. James turned, slowly. "Neither did my grandmother. She still built a home, raised 5 kids. We understood her. Just fine." The auctioneer's lips twisted. "You're serious?" Morgan stepped forward, laying down the bills. "I don't play games." Li Hua stared down at him, unsure. His eyes met hers, not hungry, not cruel, but steady. She didn't understand the words, but something in his gaze said she wasn't meat at a market. She was human. The auctioneer muttered and called it, "Sold to Mr. James Morgan." He gestured to the deputy, who stepped up and cut Li Hua's bindings. She rubbed her wrists, blinking against the sun, against the strangeness of it all. James didn't touch her. He waited until she looked at him. Then he tilted his head, slightly, as if to ask, "Ready?" She nodded. "Once." He led her through the crowd. The people parted, quiet now. Some watched with judgment, others with disbelief. Li Hua walked beside him, not behind. She didn't speak, but she lifted her chin. At the wagon, James offered her the shaded seat. She hesitated, then climbed up. He took the reins without a word, and the wagon rolled forward, away from the square, away from the platform, away from the eyes. Li Hua sat stiffly, hands in her lap, heart pounding. James said only one thing on that long, rattling ride out of town. "You're safe now." She didn't know what it meant, but the way he said it, quiet, like a vow, made her believe it. And for the first time in weeks, she let herself exhale. The wheels creaked beneath them, and dust rose like smoke in the fading light. James held the reins with one hand, the other resting loosely on his thigh. He said nothing, kept his eyes forward. The girl beside him, small, still, wrapped in the same dull shawl, clutched a cloth bag in her lap like it held her whole world. Li Hua didn't look at him. She stared straight ahead, her spine stiff, her eyes locked on the horizon. Her knuckles were white from gripping the strap. James glanced her way a few times, measuring her silence, her tension. She had not spoken since the auction block, not even when he helped her into the wagon, not even when the town fell behind them and the open plains took over. By the time the cabin came into view, simple, one story, flanked by a barn and 2 weathered corral fences, the sun had dropped low, casting the valley in gold. James brought the wagon to a stop and climbed down first. He didn't offer a hand. He figured she wouldn't want the touch. She hesitated before following, stepping down carefully, bag held tight to her chest. Her eyes scanned the surroundings. The chicken coop, the woodpile, the smoke curling from the chimney. No other people. No voices. Just him and the wind. James walked ahead, then paused at the porch. "Your room's to the left," he said. "There's warm water in the basin." Li Hua didn't answer, but she stepped past him and entered slowly, as if expecting a trap. He watched her disappear behind the door, then let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. Inside, the main room creaked with her light footsteps. She didn't explore. She simply stood in the corner for a moment, then knelt to place her bag beside the bed. The room was small but clean. A single bed, a window, a washstand, a chipped cup holding a sprig of lavender. Someone had once tried to make it home. Maybe his late wife. Maybe James himself in his clumsy, wordless way. In her room, Li Hua dipped her hands into the water bowl, wincing at how cold they'd gotten. She wiped her face, then her arms, scrubbing off the dust from town, from the wagon, from every hand that had touched her since the ship docked. Her shoulders trembled, but she didn't cry. In the main cabin, James moved quietly, lighting the fire, pulling off his boots. He ladled stew from the pot into a bowl, but didn't touch it. His appetite had left him back in Dusty Creek. He stood by the fire for a long time, arms folded, staring into the flames. He could hear her movements, soft, careful. She was probably too scared to sleep. He couldn't blame her. As the fire dwindled, James grabbed a blanket, opened the back door, and walked to the barn. He didn't even consider taking the second bed in the house. That would have felt like something he hadn't earned. The horses stirred as he entered. He found a place in the straw near the wall and spread the blanket out. The scent of hay and old pine hung in the air. He lay down, staring up at the rafters, letting the ache of the day settle in his bones. Inside, Li Hua curled beneath the blanket, eyes wide in the dark. She had not taken off her shoes. She could hear nothing but the crackle of embers and the creak of wood. No footsteps, no heavy breathing from the next room, no man in the shadows. She crept to the window and looked out. In the moonlight she could see the outline of the barn door, closed, and beyond it faint orange light flickering through the cracks. He was out there. She didn't understand everything he'd said, but she understood enough. He wasn't sleeping in the house. He was giving her space. She returned to bed, wrapped the blanket tighter, and pressed her cheek to the pillow. The scent of cedar, faint and unfamiliar, clung to the fabric. Her eyelids grew heavy. The silence didn't feel like fear anymore. It felt like the first kindness. Morning came early in the valley. Long before the sun fully rose above the hills, the sky blushed pale gray, and the first birds stirred in the brush. Li Hua moved like a shadow through the yard, her feet bare, her shawl wrapped tight. She carried 2 metal pails, one in each hand, filled with cold water from the stream that ran near the back field. The handles creaked softly. She made no sound. James watched from the barn, half hidden behind a beam, arms crossed. He had been doing that most mornings, just watching. Not in a way that pressed or pried, just quietly, with something like respect. He always returned before the house fully stirred, laid out the vegetables she'd pulled from the dry garden rows, carrots, a few onions, some wilted greens, and disappeared into her room again. Never asked for anything, never spoke. He, in turn, never knocked. He left warm bread, boiled eggs, and black tea on a wooden tray outside her door every morning, steam curling up into the hallway. She never took the tray while he watched, but when he came back an hour later, it was always empty. This quiet became their rhythm. Days passed. One morning, when he went to retrieve the tray, something new rested atop it. A folded square of linen, stitched with small, delicate red thread. A handkerchief. The edges were uneven, but careful. A single flower bloomed in the corner. He turned it over once, then twice, his hand slowing. No words, just thread, but it said more than silence ever could. That evening he cooked supper, nothing fancy, just rabbit stew and fresh bread, and placed an extra bowl on the table, not beside his own, but across, like an invitation with space. She did not come. But later, when he stepped out to tend the horses, the extra bowl was empty and clean. He smiled. That night he didn't sleep in the barn. Instead, he took the blanket and laid it out near the hearth on the floor of the main room. Just close enough for warmth, just far enough to not intrude. She heard him, she always did, but she didn't protest. She let the light from the fire flicker through her door. The next day, the silence between them felt softer. She began to stay longer in the kitchen, quietly rinsing vegetables or drying herbs from the window hook. She still didn't speak, but her presence was no longer ghost-like. He began to notice small changes, the way her braid hung looser in the evenings, the way she paused when the wind lifted through the trees like a memory, the way she never asked, but always gave something, tidied the hearth, stacked the firewood, folded the dishcloths. One evening, just as the sun melted behind the western ridge, James stood at the doorway, watching her brush soil from a bunch of wild onions she'd gathered. She sat on the steps, legs tucked beneath her, face flushed from the day's heat. He cleared his throat. He looked up, startled, then froze. He stepped closer, slowly, like approaching a spooked colt, held out a hand, not for hers, just open, empty. "I don't know how much you understand," he said gently, "but this house, it's yours now, if you want it to be. You don't have to keep packing your things. You don't have to keep sleeping like you're ready to leave." She stared at him, unblinking. Then slowly, so slowly, she lowered her gaze. Not in fear. In something else. Gratitude. A breath escaped her lips, not quite a word. Her shoulders trembled once, and she clutched the onions tighter to her chest. James didn't step closer. He just nodded once, turned, and went back inside. Later that night, when she passed through the main room, she found the red-stitched handkerchief tucked neatly beside a bowl of tea, waiting on the table, and beside it another folded cloth. Blank, waiting for her next message. The dry season had settled over the land like a second skin, cracked, relentless, and full of silence. The fields hadn't seen real rain in weeks, and even the chickens scratched with half-hearted effort, as if too tired to bother. But inside the ranch, something softer had begun to bloom. James didn't push, he never did. But each morning he showed her how things worked. He demonstrated with patience, never raising his voice, never assuming she understood until she showed him she did. And slowly, Li Hua responded. They started with the chickens. James guided her hands gently, showing her how to mix the feed, oats, cornmeal, and grit, how to scatter it just right so the birds didn't peck each other to pieces. He showed her the rhythm of the task, the small details that kept the birds laying, that kept the eggs from cracking. She listened without a word, watching him carefully, nodding when she understood. Sometimes she would mimic the gesture with exaggerated slowness, waiting for his nod in return. Then came the cows. He led her to the barn, where the old brown milk cow stood chewing with lazy indifference. James crouched beside her and demonstrated how to place the stool just so, how to squeeze and pull gently, how not to jerk. Li Hua hesitated at first, but then she knelt, braid falling forward, and tried. The first stream was crooked, the second missed the pail entirely, but on the third, the milk hit true. She looked up at him, and he gave her a small, crooked smile. She didn't smile back. Not yet. But her eyes lit briefly. Later that week, she surprised him. She cleared a small space in the kitchen and began gathering things. Banana leaves from a dried bundle she'd brought in her bag. Sticky rice she had salvaged from a tin. Ginger root she had peeled and sliced with care. He watched from the doorway, as she soaked, wrapped, folded. When he stepped forward, curious, she motioned for him to sit. Then she handed him a banana leaf, pointed to the rice, and tapped her fingers against the counter 3 times. "Copy me." James tried, clumsily. The leaf tore, the rice spilled. She didn't laugh. Yet. She only took his hands and guided them, slowly, patiently, as he had guided hers. The ginger steamed in a pot nearby. The scent filled the cabin. That night they ate together on the porch. She handed him a bowl of the sticky rice with ginger syrup. He tasted it and exhaled, surprised. "Good," he said. "Really good." She looked down, but her hands stilled for a moment, the smallest hint of pride softening her shoulders. It became their pattern. He taught her what he knew. She returned the gift in kind. One afternoon, the wind changed. James was stacking hay when the clouds rolled in without warning. Thunder cracked across the open sky, and the first fat drops began to fall before he had time to get the tools inside. Li Hua was near the chicken coop, holding a small wooden pail, when the downpour hit. She gasped, half from shock, half from the sudden cold. James called out, waving her toward the barn. They both ran, feet slipping on the wet clay, shirts soaked in seconds. She reached the barn first and ducked under the overhang just as James rounded the corner. His boot caught on a loose board. He stumbled forward, arms flailing, and landed, hard, straight into the old wash barrel with a splash loud enough to scare the birds. Water erupted like a fountain. Li Hua froze. Her eyes widened. Then her hand flew to her mouth, and she laughed. Not a quiet, polite laugh. A real one, from deep in her chest. It was light and ringing and completely unexpected. James sat in the barrel, dripping and blinking. He stared at her, stunned. Not because he was wet, but because it was the first time he'd ever heard her laugh. He stared, as if the sound itself was a miracle. Her cheeks flushed. She tried to stop, but the more she looked at him, hair stuck to his forehead, shirt plastered to his chest, the more the giggle rose again. He chuckled then, low and rough. "Glad to see my pride's good for something." She covered her mouth, but her eyes sparkled. And just like that, the silence between them cracked, just a little, and something new slipped through. That night, as rain tapped soft against the roof and the fire warmed the cabin, James sat across from her, still drying his boots, and she handed him a small towel, one she had embroidered with a tiny raindrop in red thread. He looked at it, then at her, and smiled. This time she smiled back. James returned from the fields at dusk, dusty hands calloused, hoping for the stillness of evening. Inside, Li Hua sat at the small wooden table, charcoal in hand and a stack of paper spread before her, the pale lamplight tracing her careful strokes. She glanced up, startled. She had not expected him to arrive so soon. On the top sheet lay a scene he recognized even before he understood. A village caught in flames, thatched roofs consumed by fire. Li Hua's hand trembled slightly as she drew the smoldering beams. She moved to another page, sketching a small boy, thin, arms outstretched, mouth frozen in a silent cry. A locket hung delicately around his neck. The third drawing showed a train trailing into the horizon, a lone girl clutching a small bundle amid boxcars. James cleared his throat softly. She looked away, her mouth pressed tight. He didn't ask. He simply took a seat beside her and watched as she folded each drawing with solemn deliberation, tucking them into a folded cloth. His presence was patient, waiting without pressure. When she finished, she unfolded the largest image, the burning village, and pressed it forward. Her finger traced the flames, then moved to the figure of the girl holding the boy's hand on a distant hill, then followed the train. He saw her story: loss, escape, exile. She placed head on table, ragged breaths shaking the cloth. He waited, giving her time. At last she lifted her gaze, eyes red but unswerving. He reached out, smoothing the drawing, tucking it carefully into his breast pocket. His hand paused there, silent promise that no words were needed. She blinked in surprise. He nodded once and stood. Later, by firelight, he gathered scrap timber and set to work. He fashioned a small wooden box, edges smoothed, splinters sanded away, a simple lid carved with care. Inside he placed the folded drawings and beside them a comb of polished wood, each tooth fine and even, crafted by his own hands. He shut it with confidence and brushed sawdust from his trousers. Crouched that night, by the hearth's glow, Li Hua stared into nothingness, lost in memory and longing. James placed the wooden box between them. She looked up, puzzled. He lifted the lid, revealing her drawing and the comb. He lifted the comb and pressed it into her hand, smooth, unspoiled wood warmed by his touch. His voice was low and even. Your past does not have to disappear, but your future, if you will it, can begin here. Her eyes widened as words caught in her throat. He squeezed her fingers gently. She nodded, tears gathering, yet a fragile smile forming at her lips. The next evening, with twilight draping the sky, Li Hua sat at the table, a small notebook open before her. James leaned in the doorway, watching. She raised a page, where two careful English words stood. Thank you. Her voice was hesitant but clear. Thank you. He closed the notebook softly and replied, You're welcome. After that, nightly lessons began. James admitted he'd never ventured far enough to learn another tongue. Li Hua hummed hymns in Mandarin, melodies of her homeland drifting through the quiet. He guided her through English essentials, days of the week, animal names, asking for water or warmth. She mimicked each word, brow furrowed in concentration until her pronunciation rang true. He quietly applauded. In turn, she taught him Mandarin. He stumbled over its tonal intricacies, but her laughter, soft, genuine, encouraged him. She taught one evening, pointing to his chest. Heart. He repeated until she nodded, satisfied. One dawn he found her at the door, hair loose, eyes bright in the early light. He carried a bucket of water. She smiled and simply said, Thank you. The moment was small, but it spoke volumes. From then on, morning meals became shared rituals, warm bread and tea, the wooden comb resting beside her plate like a silent emblem of their bond. In the corner of his ranch, new roots were taking hold, nourished by mutual trust, patience, and kindness that bridged history and language. And in the hush of night, when wind rattled the rafters, neither was alone anymore. Dusty Creek stirred with whispers long before the sun rose. Word traveled fast in towns like this, faster than trains, faster than truth. By breakfast, every saloon and dry goods store buzzed with the same line, Morgan's got himself a Chinese wife. They said it with scorn, with laughter, with disbelief. It reached every porch and poker table. No one cared that she was quiet, or small, or walked with her eyes lowered. They only saw difference and judged it. At midday, Li Hua stepped onto the main street to fetch supplies. Her silk-trimmed sash caught the sun, delicate against the dust. She felt the silence close in as she passed, the unnatural stillness of eyes lingering too long, of heads turning but not speaking. The whisper of boots scraping wood followed her like a ghost. Near the saloon, a group of men blocked her way. Whiskey flushed their faces, cruelty shone in their grins. Hey, Teresa, one jeered, twisting her name into something foreign. Bring any dumplings with you? Or maybe Morgan keeps him in her sleeves, another chimed in. Bet he paid less than he did for that mule of his. Li Hua gripped her basket tighter, eyes lowered. Dignity burned quietly in her silence. One man staggered forward, bent in a mocking bow. Come on, sweetheart, give us a peek. $50 must have bought something worth looking at. Laughter swelled. The others clapped and snorted. Li Hua backed away, basket trembling in her hands. She blinked against the tears. Then, suddenly, he was there. James. No words, just his presence. Just the firm clasp of his hand over hers. Just the steel of his body stepping between her and them. The crowd stilled. No one spoke now. James didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, said enough. He turned, keeping Li Hua close, and walked her down the boardwalk. She followed, barely breathing. Back home, the silence lingered, but it was warmer. James guided her to the kitchen table. She sat without speaking. He knelt to remove her slipper, tying it gently. She pressed a hand to her chest, unable to meet his gaze. Then, slowly, he crossed the room. From inside his coat, he unwrapped a worn, leather-bound Bible and laid it before her. She looked at him, puzzled. He opened it. Tucked inside was a single folded document. Li Hua stared. It was a marriage certificate, her name beside his, in slow, careful English letters, signed, witnessed, real. She reached out, fingers hovering over the paper, then touching it lightly. Her name, in ink, not whispered, not passed in secret, written. James spoke, voice low, steady. "We'll have a ceremony, if you want it. Not for the town, for you." She looked up at him, eyes wide. "Why?" she asked, barely audible. He stepped closer, brushed a lock of hair from her face. "Because you deserve better than stares. Because I believe in who you are. And because," his voice faltered just slightly, "because I love you." She pressed the certificate to her chest, tears shining now. "Yes," she whispered, "I want that." James placed the paper on a clean page in the Bible, then closed it, gently, reverently. They sat at the table, the wind rattling faintly outside, the fire snapping in the hearth. He took her hand again. She did not pull away. In that kitchen, love wasn't loud. It wasn't grand. It didn't need to be. It just was. And in Li Hua's chest, something rooted, something strong and steady, and finally hers. The sun rose gently behind the ridge, brushing the sky in soft pinks and gold, as though it too understood the quiet solemnity of the day. Under the sprawling branches of an old oak tree behind the house, James stood waiting. He had combed his hair, shaved with care, and wore the same black coat he had worn to his brother's wedding nearly a decade earlier. It was tight at the shoulders now, but clean, respectful. Li Hua stepped into the clearing moments later. Her dress was simple, ivory linen that had once belonged to James's late mother, refitted and hand-stitched by her own patient hands. She wore no veil, only a small comb carved from cedar, holding her hair away from her face. Her cheeks were flushed, not from makeup, but from morning wind and shy anticipation. They stood beneath the oak, its limbs creaking softly above them, and waited in silence. The only other soul present was Reverend Moore, a retired circuit preacher who'd baptized half the valley. He wore a threadbare collar and smelled faintly of tobacco and old rain. His voice, when he spoke, was as steady as the tree they stood beneath. "No choir," he said gently, flipping open a small Bible. "No pews, but the Lord listens better when it's just heart and earth." James took Li Hua's hands in his, and her fingers closed around his with a light trembling. He looked at her, not just the woman who had once stood trembling in the heat of a town square, but the woman who now looked back at him with trust shaped by days of silence and evenings full of learning a language together. "You have brought more life to this land than rain ever has," he whispered. She smiled and for the first time whispered back, "Thank you for not leaving me where they did." Reverend Moore said the words, simple and sacred. They exchanged no rings, but when he pronounced them husband and wife, James reached into his coat pocket and placed a red silk ribbon around her wrist. "From your mother's basket," he murmured. "You left it in the corner cupboard." She looked down at the ribbon, touched it to her lips, and nodded. Afterward they shared tea from chipped porcelain cups on the porch. No guests, no music, only the soft rustling of dry grass and the occasional creak of the oak behind them. The tea was warm. The silence was enough. Then James stood, took a shovel from beside the porch, and gestured to the spot they had cleared the day before. Together, they planted a young, red plum tree. Its roots were bundled in burlap, its leaves barely sprouting. Li Hua knelt beside him, brushing the dirt with her bare hands, her wedding dress trailing in the earth. She whispered something in Chinese, a blessing or maybe a prayer, and patted the soil around the roots. They watered it together. The next day, she hung a small wind chime made of bamboo by the door. It had been hidden in her trunk since she arrived, wrapped in cloth, silent until now. When the wind stirred, it let out soft, high tones, like laughter heard from a distance, or a memory made of light. Every time it rang, James looked up from wherever he was, mending fence, stirring oats, brushing down the horses, and smiled. That evening, as twilight folded over the land, James took a knife from his belt and walked to the porch. Li Hua followed, curious. He knelt at the wooden beam just beside the door and carved slowly, carefully. She stood behind him, arms folded over her chest, breath held in her throat. He worked until the sun vanished, and when he stepped back, she saw what he had written. Home of James and Li Hua, where no one is for sale. Her breath caught. She touched the carving with her fingertips, tracing each letter. A tear slid down her cheek and landed on the fresh cut of the word home. He looked at her. "It's yours too now," he said simply. She did not reply with words. Instead, she wrapped her arms around him from behind, rested her head between his shoulder blades, and closed her eyes. For the first time, the land felt still, not like a cage, not like a station between two ends of escape, but still like soil before planting, like a heart ready to take root. And when the wind came again, the bamboo chimes answered, soft and clear, as if they too were finally home. Years passed like wind brushing the plains, quiet, certain, shaping life without asking permission. The Morgan Ranch did not grow through cattle or acreage, but through quiet moments. The red plum tree blossomed each spring. James built a bench beneath it. Li Hua planted jasmine beside it. They sat together in the cool dusk, letting the wind and chimes speak for them. They flew to Frankfurt, and over the winter months, they left the wind and chimes speak for them. Dusty Creek changed, too. It started the day Li Hua stood in the church back room, offering to teach children how to write their names in Chinese. "It's not just writing," she told the hesitant parents. "It's memory." At first, only a few came. Then more. She taught brushstrokes, patience, meaning. They called her Miss Li. One student stood out. Rosa. Quiet, unsmiling, orphaned after her mother died and her father disappeared along the rails. No one wanted her, but Li Hua did. He brought Rosa home one drizzly afternoon. James did not question it. He dried Rosa's shoes, handed her a wooden horse, and asked gently, "Do you like tea?" Rosa nodded once, and stayed. That night, watching her read quietly on the couch, James said, "She's small, but she fills the whole room." The town softened too. No longer whispers about the Chinese bride or the lonely widower, just the Morgans. Locals began to call their home the House of First Smiles. Li Hua never explained the past. When asked why she stayed, why she loved this hard land, she would only say, "Because I was not left behind." One evening, Rosa climbed into the porch swing beside her. "Mama?" she asked. "Were you really sold?" Li Hua paused, then nodded. "Yes, a long time ago." "Did it make you sad?" She held Rosa's hand gently. "It did, but then, a man stood up, not to buy me, but to give me a name, not with money, but with kindness." Rosa's eyes blinked. "So, he gave you a home?" "Yes," Li Hua smiled. "Exactly." James stepped onto the porch just then, brushing sawdust from his sleeves. "Everything all right?" Li Hua nodded. "We were talking about beginnings." Later, after Rosa had gone to sleep, James found Li Hua by the fire, holding the drawing she had made long ago, the burning village, her brother's face. "You kept it," he said softly. "I had to," she replied. "It's where I began. But now—" She placed the paper back into the wooden box, beside the comb, the ribbon, and a dried plum blossom. "Now I know where I'm going." James touched her hand. "With me? With you. With her. And anyone else who needs a place." He smiled. "We'll need a bigger table." "We'll build one," she said. Outside, the chimes danced. Inside, the fire glowed warm. And for the first time since that day on the auction block, Li Hua knew she belonged, not to a man, not to a town, but to love. If the story of a man who only wanted peace and a girl sold like property, yet given back her name and a home touched your heart, don't forget to hit subscribe to the Wild West Love Stories channel. Here, we tell love stories written in dust and silence, but burning deep, where promises are kept not with words, but with actions, and where love, once chosen, outlives time and fear. You'll find more than romance, you'll find people who stood beside each other, when the world gave them every reason not to. Wild West Love Stories, where hearts belong to those who dared to love across borders, blood, and silence. We'll see you in the next story.